Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, New by Newbery, where we will hear about some new middle grade reads by Newbery authors. I am Ronnie Curry, Senior Editor at Booklist. My pronouns are he and him. And before we begin, I will go over some technical details. If you're in the audience, you are in listen-only mode, but we do welcome any questions you may have. So on the bottom of your screen is a toolbar with a button for Q&A. If you have a question for the authors, or if you just need technical assistance, simply click Q&A and type your message into the box that pops up. Our team will do our best to respond to all of the tech-related questions, and we can pass along all the other questions to today's panelists. That way they can follow up with you after the webinar. We also offer closed captioning on our webinars. So to enable or disable captions on your screen, please look for and click the captions icon on the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. From there, you can select show or hide captions from the menu that appears. If you choose to enable subtitles, you can adjust the size of the captions at any time by selecting caption settings. And finally, we of course expect all participants to maintain an atmosphere of respect. Anyone who violates this standard of behavior may, at the discretion of the organizers, be removed. All right. So we have a truly great program for you today, and I'm going to go ahead and welcome today's Newbery Honor-winning panelists and invite them to turn on their cameras, unmute their microphones if they need. We are going to have Veera Hiranandani, author of 2018's The Night Diary and now A Meal and the After. We have Adam Gidwitz, the author of 2016's The Inquisitor's Tale, or as I call it, The Three Magical Children and Their Holy Dog, and now the author of Max and the House of Spies. We have Andrea Wang, author of 2021's WATERCRESS and now Summer at Squee. And we have Kimberly Brubaker Bradley, author of 2015's The War That Saved My Life, as well as 2020's Fighting Words and now The Night War. Thank you all so much for joining us. And we are going to dive right on in. So, by way of introduction, of course, Newberries always get everyone very excited, and we will touch on that topic soon. But we are definitely here to talk about your new projects. So for those who may not be familiar, I'll ask each of you, and we can start with Veera, to take just a minute or two to introduce yourself, say hi, and tell us about your new project. So Veera, can you start by telling us about A Meal and the After?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to be here. So, The Meal and the After is a companion novel to The Night Diary, and it follows the family a few months later, where we kind of left off where they eventually made it to a new home in The Night Diary, and now they've had to move again. So we start in January 1948, and now we're in Emil's point of view instead of Nisha's, and it's in third person, so a very different point of view, and he is really narrating through the third person point of view, how his family is rebuilding their lives after they've gone through what they've gone through after the partition. So I really wanted to look at what happens after we go through something very difficult. How are we both strengthened and wounded by that experience? And he shares some of these experiences in a drawing journal, which we see in the book.
Thank you very much. And I'll note on that your illustrator is Prashant Miranda, is that right?
Yep.
And really cool illustrations throughout. Next, let's hear from Adam. Can you tell us a bit about yourself and Max in the House of Spies?
Yeah, I'd love to. So Adam Gidwitz, he, him, and Max in the House of Spies is about a boy, a 12-year-old boy, who gets sent out of Nazi Germany in 1938, and he goes to England. And in England, he's placed with a Jewish family. This is actually a real historical Jewish family. So the book is mostly historical fiction, a little bit of fantasy, and other than the main character, almost all the characters in the book are real people. So he's placed with this real historical family. the Montagues, and Ewan Montague was high up in British intelligence, so he is a British spy, and Max gets to live with him. Max desperately wants to get back to Germany. It sounds crazy, but he did not want to be separated from his family, and so he wants to get back to Germany. Luckily, he's a genius. He can build a radio from the junk at the bottom of a trash can, and he tries to get himself trained as a spy so he can be sent back to his parents. The one other element is that when he is on his way to England, these two immortal creatures appear on his shoulders, a kobold and a Dybbuk, and they kibitz the whole time like Statler and Waldorf from the Muppets. That's Max and the House of Spies.
Thank you very much. Andrea, could you go next? Tell us about yourself and Summer at Squee.
Sure. I'm Andrea Wang, and my newest middle grade is Summer at Squee. It's about a third-generation Chinese-American girl named Feeny Fong, and it takes place at a Chinese heritage summer camp called the Summertime Chinese Culture, Wellness, and Enrichment Experience. So the name is so long that everyone just calls it Squee based on its acronym. And Squee is really Feeny's favorite place in the entire world. It's her safe space. She's been a camper since she was 6 years old and has made a really tight-knit group of friends that call themselves the Squad. So this is the last year that they can attend camp before they age out. And Feeny's just determined to make it like the best, most spectacular camp and summer ever. But once she arrives, she discovers that the Squad has been split up because of an influx of new campers. And she's devastated, especially when she finds out that not all the new campers want to be at Squee. And some of them don't even want to do all the cultural activities that Feeny loves. She learns that they are transracial Chinese adoptees, and the things that make her feel connected to her culture make some of them feel excluded. And so, you know, on top of that, there's the anxiety of a first crush and anti-Asian harassment by online trolls. And so Squee's really turning out to be more, you know, like stressful than spectacular. And Feeny has to learn to expand her definition of what it means to be Chinese American in order to make new friends, build a more inclusive community. And along the way, there are lots of fun camp activities and hijinks and a summer romance. And that's Summer at Squee.
Perfect. Thank you. Kim, you want to round it out?
Yes.
Thank
So my new book is called The Night War. And although it's still World War II historical fiction, as I've done in the past, it's not actually connected to my previous books. It's a new character, Miriam, who is a German Jewish refugee in Paris. Her family moves there in 1938, but then of course in 1940, when Hitler takes over Paris, it's not so good. And Miri gets caught up in what comes down to history as what's called the Veldiv Roundup. It was the French government, not the Germans, collected about 15,000 Parisian Jews, many of whom were French citizens, probably almost most, and a third of whom were children, and kept them in a velodrome, the Velodrome d'Hiver. That's where the Veldiv comes from. And the people that were caught up there were women and children predominantly, and they ended up, most of them in Auschwitz. And so the prognosis is horrifying. But Miri escapes during the roundup itself, and with her neighbor's 2-year-old, and they get sort of intermittently rescued by a Catholic nun who arranges for them to be taken to a very quiet French town called Chenonceau, which is also the home to a historic castle, Chenonceau Chateau, that happens to span the River Cher. The castle was built from the 13th to the 15th century, and it became a bridge so that the entrance on one side is above the water, and then you go across the water and exit the other side. And what's interesting about that is that river, which is called the Cher, and it's a very small French river, actually was the dividing line between Vichy France and occupied France. And so this is still before the Nazis take over the rest of the country. And people are using that castle, which is the only bridge for several miles in either direction, to smuggle people to safety from occupied France, from Vichy France, or no, sorry, from occupied France to Vichy France. And so Miri also gets caught up in that and has to decide how much she wants to try to help other people versus trying to help herself to safety.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you all. So the next couple of questions will kind of be expanding on those introductions to your books. And Andrea, I'm going to start with you on this round. Pretty common question is, and that everyone just wants to know, I think, is kind of where do ideas come from? So I want to ask each of you, what was the genesis? What drew you to this new project? But more than that, kind of what did you want to add to what your genre or the topic that you're addressing? So Andrea, if you could kick us off.
All right, thanks, Ronnie. I grew up in a really small town in Ohio, and I was the only Asian kid in my grade. And after I grew up and moved away and had kids of my own, I really wanted my kids to have that sense of belonging that I never did. So when I heard about a local Chinese heritage camp, and I was living outside of Boston at this time, I signed my kids up as soon as they were old enough. Like, they just didn't get a choice, they were going. And I also got really involved in the camp, first as a parent volunteer, and then eventually served on the organizing committee for several years. And it was just such a joyful and special place. And it kind of became a safe haven for me as well. And I really knew I had to write about being part of this community. I also hadn't seen many middle grade books set in cultural heritage camps. And so that was sort of something new that I wanted to bring to the middle grade space. And by the time that I had joined the committee, the camp was really well known to like the local community of families that had children adopted from China. And so many of the campers were adoptees, and some of their parents, served on the committee with me as well. And it was just really interesting to see and work alongside people from so many different backgrounds. We had like Chinese immigrants, their American-born children, multiracial people, adoptees, their white parents. Even there were some non-Asian children that had an interest in Chinese culture and just wanted to come to camp. And there were definitely some cultural and communication gaps, but for the most part, we worked them out. And I think I just wanted to take all of these intersecting identities and try to capture like a wide range of Chinese American experiences, to show that even within such a small community, like within the camp itself, or even within, the microcosm of a camp group, that we're not a monolith. So Summer at Squee is a book about examining your own assumptions and preconceptions and working towards inclusivity.
Beautiful. I am going to go to Kim next, and I'm sort of grouping it with Adam in the sense that same question, how did you come to this project? But I feel like there's maybe nothing more daunting than adding to that genre of World War II books or Holocaust related books. So Kim, what what made you do?
So this one came, I mean, novels are always a conglomeration of things. It's never just one idea. And this one came to me kind of in two distinct pieces. The first was that I was visiting Chenonceau, and I have gone back and spent longer, but the first day I was there, I was with my husband and son, and we had just gone from Paris on the train down to the Loire Valley for a day, and we're taking this little whirlwind tour. And the castle is amazingly beautiful. As I said, most of it was built in the 16th century by Diane de Poitiers, who was Henry II's mistress, and then Catherine de Medici, who was Henry II's wife. So basically, Diane got given Chenonceau and made this very beautiful, elaborate garden. And then Henry died, and Catherine kicked Diane out real fast and built an even bigger, better garden, over on the other side. And those gardens still exist. So I was sitting there feeling like all of this history was around me, and Catherine Medici was still hanging out because this is the one place she truly loved in her life, which was nice, but it wasn't a book. And then in 2000, I think it was 2019, I guess it was 2019. It wasn't right before the pandemic. It was a little before that. I was fortunate enough to go to Israel with PJ Library's Author Adventure program, their first cohort. And was one of the few of us who went through Yad Vashem because yeah, I think one of the big things about PJ is that there's more to Jewish stories than the Holocaust. But I have so much of a thing toward history that I wanted to go there. And while I was there, I was reading about the problem of Catholics. I'm Catholic, I'm not Jewish by background, but you know, the Catholic Church is both very, very good and very, very horrible during the Holocaust, like a lot of people. But they had a specific thing about Jewish children being hidden in French boarding schools, because in France, most kids went to Catholic boarding schools at a certain age. It wasn't an upper income thing. It was a pretty middle class thing to do. And so they had these all over the country, and they really were some people were using them to stash Jewish kids and try to save them. And I thought that was interesting. And then I found the piece about how Chenonceau was the bridge across the occupied river, which I didn't know the first time I went there. So as soon as all those three things hit, which they did inside Yad Vashem of all places, I suddenly had this story. And what's kind of funny about that is I went back out and I was with Gail Carson Levine and Stacia Deutsch. We were in a cab going back to join the rest of the group at night, and I was telling them kind of excitedly, I think I found this book, I think this and this and this and this. And Gail and Stasha both started saying, oh, well, what about this and this, and kind of asking me. And the next thing you know, the Israeli cab driver joins in and is giving me all his opinions. So they all came together, and there's the book.
Excellent. Adam, same question.
Yes, I'd love to answer, but first I just have to say I love that story about the cab driver. My favorite saying about the Jewish community, which I'm a part, is 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So I can only imagine how many opinions were in that taxi cab with you right there. That's awesome. So yeah, like 10, yeah. Yes, it is daunting to add to this history. So there was always one corner of it that I knew I wanted to write about. When I was growing up, my family had a very close family friend named Michael Steinberg, who was a music critic. But when he was 10 years old, he had been part of the Kindertransport. So his mother put him on a train, which in 1938, which took him to England, and he was placed with the family. He hadn't met them. They'd never been to England. He didn't speak any English, and he didn't know whether he would ever see his mother again. And this was part of 10,000 Jewish children being taken to England. And the reason it was just the Jewish children is because England said that the children could come, but their parents could not. So I always wanted to tell something related to Michael's story in the Kindertransport. But as Kim said, like, a book is more than one idea, and that didn't seem like thrilling enough to me. You know, it's really important to me when I write a book that it's not just educational. Obviously, it's got to be thrilling. So then I started getting really into spy books, spy novels by John le Carré, and then especially nonfiction by Ben McIntyre. And as I was reading the book Operation Mincemeat by Ben McIntyre, I learned about a Jewish family, upper middle class Jewish family like mine. I really identified with it, who was high up in British intelligence. And I was like, wait, what? Jewish spies? And then I was like, okay, maybe that's a way into this story. And then the pandemic hit. And as you will all remember, it was a moment when it felt impossible to know who was telling the truth, right? Like, some people were lying and it was obvious they were lying. And other people were saying things like, don't go to playgrounds, or like, don't wear a mask or wear a mask. And it was like, are you telling the truth? Are you intending to tell the truth and not telling the truth? And then there were people who were believing things that were so obviously lies. I don't want to offend anyone if you happened to have injected yourself with bleach, but it was like, how can people believe this? And so I was like, I needed to read about this. And so I started reading about Nazi Germany, a country that had committed itself to a series of lies, and a country that should have known better. It was the nation of poets and thinkers, is what they called themselves. And so I had the genesis of the Kindertransport and the excitement of spies. and then the question of how does a country come to commit itself to lies? And those three things together led to Max in the House of Spies. And I didn't mean to rhyme that. It just happened. I'm sorry.
It's always better.
Okay.
Veera, you have kind of the same challenge from the opposite angle, which is, and I'm actually going to tie this question into the next question for you because I think it makes sense for what you're presenting. But there's not a lot, at least in this country, about partition. And the next question is sort of tracing the path from your Newbery honor to the current project. And so this is as a companion novel. I'm curious, of course, how you decided to write this follow-up of Emile, and also if the honor, the Newbery honor coming before that, did that affect how you approached it, or add to the pressure, or how did it influence the second book?
I
It's a
have
lot.
so many things going on in my head. But Adam, that rhyme was very satisfying. So thank you. So I didn't think that I was going to write a follow-up to the Night Diary after I finished. I really felt like I had completed that arc. I had been inspired by my father's side of the family and their story when they had to leave their home during the partition. So the Night Diary was inspired by many pieces of that, as well as all of the research I did and brought in a lot of other stories into this fictional family. And it was probably about a year after I finished the Night Diary, or after the Night Diary came out, maybe even a little past, because I think it was past when the Night Diary won the Newbery Honor. And I had a lot of kids asking me like, are you gonna do a sequel? And that's always just such a sweet compliment whenever you're visiting schools, if they, because any book they like, they tend to ask that. So that was just really nice to hear. But for a while I was like, no, and they're like, no, you should do one. And we want to know more about Emile. And I just kept thinking about it, and I really couldn't figure out, well, what do I have, what's left to tell, in a sense, even though there's plenty, because I really felt like I did complete that arc in the Night Diary of the story I wanted to tell. And often when we are writing historical novels or anything that's dramatic and maybe scary or traumatic for the characters going through it, we sort of follow that arc. We focus on that crisis, and we follow the arc of, when the characters are they going to survive or not? Are they going to be okay or not? And at the end, we find out, hopefully they are okay, and then the story ends. But as we know in real life, the story doesn't end. If you've gone through something difficult and traumatic, there is so much rebuilding that has to happen. And so that was what I started to think about, what happens after. And I definitely was inspired by my readers. Okay, like, what would Emile think, and what would be his point of view? And I was writing this during the first couple years of the pandemic, and thinking about that first year and the shock of it, and what my family went through, but knowing that it was hardly as traumatic as some other people. And I had, there were really difficult things going on around me, as we all experienced. And I was thinking about, this now is in the second year, kind of how I was rebuilding my life, or trying to, still in the midst of, the pandemic, it's still here with us. But sort of how I was kind of trying to regroup and watching other people do that. And I started to create this story thinking about my father's family again, and how they went from Jodhpur to Bombay the story takes place in Bombay 1948. My family reached Bombay a few years after, so I kind of compressed the timeline. But thinking about how they rebuilt and kind of started their lives over from nothing, and that so many people had to do that. And also thinking about the responsibility of, Emile knows he's carrying a lot of difficult memories of what happened to them on their journey. scary memories, traumatic memories. He and Nisha talk about it. That's part of why he's drawing, to kind of express some of those feelings of both confusion, frustration, hope, just his sort of childlike wishes, because he really just kind of wishes he could sort of erase everything and just have this innocent life that he had before. But he also meets somebody. He meets somebody in a refugee camp who is, they find out, I hope I'm not spoiling it too much, but they find out he's an orphan, and he has to really wrestle with the fact that, you know, he has a home and he has a father and a grandmother and a sister taking care of him, and, you know, being his, you know, supporting him that way. And he, this new friend that he so desperately wants, has so much less of that and is sort of less lucky. He uses the word lucky because he starts to realize the randomness of everything and how he is no different than his new friend, who is suffering tremendously. And he's asking himself, well, what is my responsibility, even though I am still suffering from what I've gone through, to somebody who's suffering even more. And so that's, you know, a big question he's wrestling with. And that was something that I was thinking about for the pandemic. So I was kind of trying to put that all into a story. And again, following some of the things that my father's family went through.
Thank you. I feel like children's storytelling in general is moving towards that idea that the after has so much story to tell as well. Like there's the splashy external conflict, but beyond that, the internal challenges remain, and there's so much story to tell there, and so much important stuff to explore there too.
Yeah.
So Adam, I'm going to restate the question for the other three of you, which is that I want to trace the path from your Newbery Honor to your current project generally. You've all been honored by the Newbery Committee. Your books, your current books, just happen to be related to your winning books, even if it's just by theme or genre or character. So how was it for you, for your career, however you want to approach it, to win that honor, and how does it to this day affect kind of the work you're doing on your current project?
Yeah, it was terrible. No, I'm just kidding. It was fantastic. Honestly, when I was writing The Inquisitor's Tale, you know, about three kids who have magical powers and are maybe saints, right? One of whom is Jewish and the other whom are you know, medieval Christians. Um, I shared it with one of my best friend from high school, and he read it in an early draft, and he said, "Adam, I liked it, but I'm not sure that you should publish this." And I was like, "Oh, really?" And he was like, "I think people are going to be upset. I honestly think it could be the end of your career. I think you should really think hard about it." And I did think hard about it, and I was like, "Well, let's do it." And the fact that the response was so positive, that it got a Newbery Honor, like really emboldened me, I think. So now, like taking on the hardest period of a super hard period of history, not the hardest, but a super hard period of history, both because of what's happening in it, World War II and the Holocaust, but also because of how well documented it is and how many people have written about it. And taking that on with, you know, mythical creatures living on his shoulders, um, and trying to take on this kind of difficult question of the truth and lies, you know, between the truth and your mother, between the truth and justice, and what do you choose? I felt emboldened to do that because of the Newbery Honor and the response to that book, which is an incredible gift. So hopefully people like this one too. Maybe this will be my last book. You know, the Newbery gave me like at least one more big swing, and we'll see what happens.
You'll never write in this town again, Adam.
Exactly.
Andrea, a bit different for you in a fascinating way, I think, because you were honored for a picture book. And if I'm not mistaken, you then turned to publishing middle grade after that. And this is not your first, it's your second, I believe. But same question, how was that? And I can only imagine the pressure of moving into middle grade from a picture book Newbery.
Yeah. So winning the Newbery Honor for WATERCRESS was a complete surprise, and it still feels really surreal, especially because it is a picture book. And I don't know that anybody really knows this, but I started out writing a middle grade. long, long ago. That novel's still in the drawer. Probably will never see the light of day. But I started writing picture books because it seemed easier. Like it was finite. It was 1,000 words. I could dash it off, right? Which is not true because WATERCRESS took 8 years or more. But by the time that WATERCRESS won the award, I was under contract already to write 2 middle grade novels. And so it was an adjustment, definitely. Like I had a lot more words to play with, a lot more pages that I could use. And I wasn't quite sure about that first middle grade, The Many Meanings of Meilon. But the Newbery, similar to what Adam said, emboldened me, right? It was this huge validation. And, the stories that I was telling about the Chinese American experience were being appreciated by people. And they seemed necessary to some people. And, even people who didn't identify as Chinese American were resonating with these books and these stories. So that was very empowering and very validating. I think specifically for Summer at Squee, also, I just wanted to dive more into that idea of the Chinese American experience, kind of trusting that readers will know that this can apply to them as well, even if they don't share that identity or that culture. On a very practical level, I found it really difficult to balance writing this book with all of the stuff that comes along with winning the Newbery. It was like another year of promotion and, this huge increase in author events and school visits, which are wonderful. But, Feeney's camp group has 16 characters in it. And so I needed to be fully immersed for long periods of time to, get to know their voices again and be able to write their characters. And so it delayed, the book, the Newbery did, because I couldn't focus on it the way that I needed to. So it's finally out next Tuesday. I'm very excited about that.
Thank you. Kim, you've won 2 pretty recently. Fighting Words more recently, and before that, The War That Saved My Life, which is kind of the focus of this question, since it's the one that connects. So you stepped away from historical for a moment, came back to France. So tell us about how kind of this second, more recent book was influenced by that Newbery honor, that first one.
Well, I think the main thing my son said after War That Saved My Life won a Newbery honor, he said, "You're not allowed to write bad books anymore." And he was like 16 or something. I mean, it was the perfect age to say something like that to your mother. But it's been both an incredible honor and I wouldn't say a curse. I would say more like a goad. So The War That Saved My Life, the very first draft that I sent to my editor, the first 80 pages, she wrote back, "This isn't really your next book, is it?" Which is not what you want to hear. And it took me a long, long time to get my vision for that book onto the page. But I kind of learned that if I worked hard enough, I could do it. And that was, and then there was the Newbery, so I got the big shiny reward at the end. And that's kind of changed how I write. And this was true with Fighting Words too, even though I wasn't really expecting to write Fighting Words. I kind of realized that I have to push myself harder in order to write something that's of higher quality. And it was the Night War I was kind of waiting to see, is if I kept working hard, would the book I wanted to show up? Because for a while I had a perfectly passable middle grades novel, but not the quality I wanted it to be. And I think we got it there. I write an absolutely stupid amount of drafts. I'm averaging about 7 or 8 right now. So in terms of my the books that are good, full rewrites, top to bottom.
Awesome, thank you.
And in between there's a book that didn't win anything, which was the sequel to The War That Saved My Life, The War I Finally Won. So,
Well, it won some things, just not a Newbery.
did I answer the question? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just kind of your journey and what it was for you.
Yeah. Mhm.
So I read somewhere that a book of answers is a manifesto, whereas a book of questions is a catalyst. I read that in Adam's book, actually. Thank you, Adam. So I'll start with you. And I want to ask each of you, what question did you want to pose to readers with this work? And if it applies, to catalyze what in your readers?
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot of questions, but the major one, the book, as the inscription, starts with a quote, a sort of quote from Albert Camus. And the quote is, "Between the truth and my mother, I choose my mother." He didn't exactly say that, and I kind of changed it because I say he sort of said it. And I think that when I started writing this book, and unfortunately even more now, a lot of us are facing this question of our loyalties might lie in one place, and what we see as the truth might start to be somewhere else. And how do we navigate that? So, Max in this first book, so Max in the House of Spies is the first half of a duology, and the second is Max in the Land of Lies, and it will come out next year at exactly this time. He's got to face some difficult moral quandaries, like, what will I do to get back to my parents? Will I betray people who I care about? Will I lie? Will I do things that are wrong and unjust? And I think on bigger and smaller scales, we kind of are all facing those questions, and so I wanted to force my readers, in addition to having fun reading like a historical spy novel with mythical creatures kibbutzing on his shoulders, I want to ask my readers, like, what would you do? What would you do if you had to choose between the thing you love most in the world and what you know is right?
Thank you. Let's go to Veera. Were there any questions you were particularly trying to pose to catalyze readers?
Yes, many. And they're really questions I have all the time, and I really, my books tend to be sort of embodying the questions I'm having about whatever's going on currently. Even though, I'd like to think that we do learn from history and we become better over time. And unfortunately, I don't think that's the case. And so I send these books out in a way, not rewriting history in any kind of way, I hope, but taking a perspective of that kind of childlike, sort of fearless questioning of, like, why is the world like this? And why is it so random? And why are the identities we are kind of born into and live under so important and causing so many problems, honestly? And so, Emil is asking himself that because he has a Muslim mother and a Hindu father, and his country has been split apart across religious lines, but he has an identity connection to sort of both sides. And his father is a doctor, and his father is very secular and says things like, it's all kind of underneath everything, it's just blood and bones. And so Emil is noticing kind of what's happening. He's watching refugees come into Mumbai and Bombay, and he's watching people go out, and he's hearing and seeing all kinds of stories, horrific stories of things that have happened to people. I try really hard, I just want to say that I try really hard there to portray the stories through that kind of childlike vision and through the protectiveness around him. So, you know, I'm always hoping that I'm kind of there's a recognition of some of the violent things going on, but I don't describe them in a graphic way unless, like, you know, Emil is experiencing them directly. But he, you know, doesn't really, but he's observing all of this and asking this question and seeing this friend who is having a much harder time and has been just sort of abandoned as a refugee, and now he's an orphan. You know, just he's understanding that it's just so random if you're like okay or not in the world. And that's a really hard thing, I think, for a child to have to understand. And so that's really the question he's asking, like, why do I get to be okay and somebody else isn't? And I ask myself that every day. So, you know, that's one of the big questions.
I have to say there was a literal question towards the end of the book. I forget exactly which character said it, but somebody says, you know, we're better than this. And then somebody responds, are we better than this though? And you kind of let that question echo. You know, you don't try to answer it or resolve it.
Yeah.
But that is one that has really stuck with me, and I'm sure will continue to. But I appreciated that you sort of let the question breathe at the end there.
Yeah, that's his father says that, you know, based on something he hears about, and Emil's like, but are we though? So
Yeah. Andrea, your turn. Were there any particular questions you were trying to drive towards?
Yeah, I guess in my books, I'm always questioning identity. And with Summer at Squee, it was kind of, you know, what does it really mean to be part of a culture? Culture is constantly evolving, and Chinese American culture is very different than, say, Chinese culture growing up in China. And so, you know, I wanted, I think, readers to question their own assumptions and preconceptions about other people, that even though someone might look like you, or they might appear to be from the same culture as you, that they also might have had a completely different experience of that culture from you. And I guess in response to sort of the catalyst part of your question, I, you know, wanted to catalyze curiosity in the reader, you know, to have them sort of examine their own, you know, implicit biases. And the way that Feeny grew up, she grew up surrounded by, you know, her immigrant grandparents and her second generation parents. And she's third gen, but she really embraces everything that she thinks is traditional in Chinese culture. And, you know, so she views the world through this lens and expects everybody else, especially people at camp, to, you know, love these things as much as she does and to think about these things the way that she does. And it's kind of a shock for her when she realizes that they don't. And it's not just the adoptees who don't, it's even her own friends that she's known for years and years. She's constantly discovering that their relationship to their culture is different from hers.
What about you, Kim? Were there any big questions that were driving you?
Yeah, the first one, I'm trying to figure out how to say this correctly, because when I was a kid, I read a lot of, well, I read a lot of books, period. But the books that I read about the Holocaust, there was sort of this theme where it would be that these people didn't really know they were Jewish, or they weren't really practicing Jews, and they got caught up in it. And when I was a kid, even, I thought that had this underlying thing of they didn't deserve it because they weren't really Jewish, which then the flip side of that is the ones who are really Jewish do deserve it, which is, of course, a horrific thing. And I think it kind of falls into some of, I mean, right now, unfortunately, this book is more timely than I want because of the anti-Semitism that's really all over the country right now, probably the world. And so I really wanted to well, so you take that on the one side, and then you take the reckoning I had personally at Yad Vashem, because, as I said, I was raised Catholic and had looked super hard at the actions of all the Catholics. And of course, I would have said there were lots of popes that were not good people. That's pretty documented. But in Yad Vashem, there was all of this there was a whole display on the propaganda deliberately promulgated by the Catholic Church in the 1930s against Jewish people. And it was sort of horrifying. It was sort of some of the catalyst of how the whole World War II happened, and how, people in Germany and in Poland especially went along with this. And so I was trying to kind of explore the difference between religion and morality, so that you can be both very religious and very moral, or you can be very religious and not very moral, or very moral and not very religious. And I kind of have characters, all of that. So I have, my main character, Miri, who goes by Marie when she's being hidden in this Catholic convent school, is still praying, but she's praying her own prayers. What she learns, she learns all the rote prayers, but when she's inside her head, she's praying the prayers that she grew up with. And you have this whole group of nuns that are running the place that have very different views on what their religion says their response to Nazi Germany ought to be. And so that's kind of the thing I'm trying to explore is, what's the difference between goodness and piety.
Kim, I'm going to stay with you for the next question.
Sure.
You mentioned that unfortunately, that your book feels very timely. And I would say that for all of these books, another element that connects these novels is that they're all, exploring confronting prejudice and violence on some level against marginalized groups. And I want to talk about that in terms of your audience, which is middle graders. And so how do you bring these topics, how do you enlighten middle grade readers to these real horrors while also protecting them, which in my mind is one of kind of the hallmarks of writing for middle grade, right? And Kim, you're no stranger to hard topics, so I thought.
I'm just laughing because fighting words was, which was not historical, was the biggest challenge of all of everything I've written in terms of not being honest and yet being age appropriate is really the question. And I think the first thing is to start with being honest, because I really think that kids understand. They understand that not everyone is a good person, and they understand that people can be pretending to be good or being hiding behind rules or things like that. But at the same time, it's just sort of the graphicness of what you want to show them. So I really wanted a hopeful Holocaust book. I know that sounds terrible, but if I had taken Mary inside that velodrome versus letting her escape before she gets there, it's a different level of fear. It's a different level of sort of sensory overload. And so I think that that's really what you're trying to do and that's kind of what Veera was saying, is that she's letting her character experience some violence, but she's not letting the reader experience the whole range of violence that's possible. And so, obviously there's a lot more in the Holocaust that's much worse than the things I'm depicting in the Night War. But I hope the things that I'm depicting are still as honest as the things that are more gruesome.
I feel like I should kick it to Adam after that.
Yeah, I really respect the way that Kim thinks about it. I'll add something different because I don't want to just repeat what she said. I have a rule for myself, which is that whatever I want to get across in the book, whatever I want to say, the themes, the big questions, are irrelevant if the kids aren't turning the pages and reading the book, right? So my first priority is to get the kids having a good time and wanting to read it and loving it. And then I can ask some really difficult questions. Kids, more than grown-ups, right? I can write, like my first book, A Tale Dark and Grim, I can write like a fairy tale horror comedy with huge questions about your parents. kids, because they're not restricted by genre. Whereas if I'm writing a horror or a comedy for adults, you're not supposed to get all that philosophical. So I can do all those things, but my first priority is I got to make kids want to turn the pages, like love reading the book. So to accomplish that in Max in the House of Spies, first of all, it's about spies, and that's awesome. And then I also created these two characters, Stein and Berg, the kobold and the Dybbuk, that are living on his shoulders and kibitzing and, like just trying to make his life terrible. And hopefully we're laughing. And so, yeah, so it's just important to me that, like, as heavy as the world is, um, in World War II, though as heavy the world is now, kids have something that they're really having a great time with. And if they are, then I can ask those questions that I really want to dig into.
Kim, did you want to add something?
And I would, yeah, I had what Adam said made me realize one of the things that I think is really important too, which is you want your characters to be real enough that the kids care very much about what happens to them specifically. And as soon as they're invested in that character, then they can start to feel the emotions that the character's feeling and see the shock and everything. And an example for Miri is very early in the book, she trips on the street and is saved from falling and crushing some food that's very important to her family by a policeman who's one of her classmates' friends. And that same policeman later is arresting the people in her apartment and rounding them up. And so, her first feeling when she sees him is, oh, here's that good guy, except that he's, taking her neighbor and imprisoning them. So I think once the kids care about the characters for some reason, you can use very small things to make it matter a lot.
Yeah. Veera, you touched on this a bit as far as point of view and things like that. Do you want to add anything to how you kind of care for your readers? And you're still on mute.
Okay. When I write, some people experience kind of observing their characters. I'm sure everybody has their different mode. And some people, really become their characters. Maybe that's more common. I don't really know, but I feel like I really become my main character. I'm not sort of observing Emil when I'm writing. I am Emil. And I remember very clearly when I was a kid hearing about the partition. I remember seeing the movie Gandhi when I was 11. So there's a lot going on in that movie, and it shows a lot of the violence that happened during the partition. That was a really eye-opening moment for me, because it was the first time I realized that my family history and the stories my father and my uncles and aunts were telling me was this partition that I was suddenly watching. I mean, of course, it's a big Hollywood, depiction of what happened, but a lot of the violence that happens in that movie did happen, absolutely. And as it was like I only let in what I could handle, and I was still observing it. So I tend to write characters who are more adjacent to something happening or observing something that's happening. I don't think I could handle writing a middle grade novel where the character was experiencing this direct graphic violence, right? That's not really my job as a middle grade author. But I think when you're a kid and like the whole story isn't really being told to you, sometimes that can be even scarier. You sort of fill in like something worse and more abstract and even scarier. So it's really like pushing that up against that, like telling the reader, this is what happened. You're getting this general sense. Do they need to know every, horrible graphic story I read in my research? No, they don't. But they need to know kind of the truth of what happened. I think Kim might have said that. So it's hard though. It's a balancing act.
Yeah. Andrea, I want to preface your turn just by saying your book has this incredible like positive energy. There's of course plenty of conflict, but for the most part, it felt like you're showcasing cooperation and learning, understanding, and all these great things. But then at the same time, there is this dark thread of violence and prejudice. So can you talk about kind of bringing that into the mix?
Yeah. So I think like the other panelists, I was writing this book during the pandemic. And anti-Asian violence was really spiking during the pandemic. Not that anti-Asian violence is anything new, it's just it peaked. And that really affected my state of mind. And suddenly, you know, I had friends talking about how they were afraid to go on the subway or even to take out their trash or to go anywhere. And I happen to live in a state with a lot of guns. And I also felt very unsafe. And, you know, I started questioning like what would happen if Feeney's safe space also became no longer a safe space. And so I brought in that thread of, you know, these online trolls when the counselors start posting pictures of the fun activities they do at camp or videos to social media, you know, the online trolls are attacking. And I very deliberately did not write any of those comments in detail. I think the only comment that one of the counselors reads out to the kids is that you should be scared, but there's nothing to talk about. It doesn't say like what they should be scared about. Again, like, you know, everyone else was saying, they don't need to know the graphic details. Any middle schooler with access to the internet knows how awful trolls on social media can be. And what they envision is probably, you know, enough, right? And I didn't want to write anything that would, you know, maybe they wouldn't be ready for, right? It didn't need to be super graphic. And I felt like I could bring in this thread, especially in this camp setting, because I could touch upon it, like what Veera was saying, like this is what's happening in the larger world. But at the same time, all the campers are on this secluded campus. They're very protected. So there's that sort of threat, but, you know, nothing, you know, they're just resisting, right? By being joyful, you know, joy is an act of resistance, as the quote goes. So I didn't really want readers themselves to feel unsafe in the larger world.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that was really well handled. I think all of you did a very, very good job of that with a lot of very tough topics. So we only have a couple minutes left, unfortunately. I feel like I didn't get to any of my fun questions, sadly. But let's end on a lighter note, and I'll ask you to be somewhat brief. But just school visits and reconnecting with readers. So as Newbery authors, you're all experienced in that department. And I'll just ask you if you have a favorite little anecdote or question you've been asked from a young audience member in the past. Bonus points if it ties to one of the books we've been talking about. But Adam, do you mind kicking that off?
Sure. So at every school that I go to when I'm talking about this book, I ask the kids, I have them decode a coded message. And the coded message is, between justice and my mother, I choose ... And then the kids debate, what would they choose, justice or their mother? And boy, does it get exciting in there. And then I've heard amazing things. But maybe the most memorable was I was in a huge middle school, and this boy raised his hand, and he was wearing noise canceling earphones, and I was hoping that he was like totally keeping up with this very complex conversation that was happening. And I said, "Who would you choose? What would you choose?" And he said, "My mommy." And I said, "Why would you choose your mommy?" And he said, "She cooks for me." I said, "Yes." And then he goes, "Cookies." And the whole audience was like, "Woo!" And he got a standing ovation. It was great.
That is great. Thank you. Kim, how about you?
So this goes back to, I actually have another French World War II book from, I think it's 2002. It's barely still in print, but it's called For Freedom. But it's about a 13-year-old girl who is a true story, who really did spy for the French resistance in her hometown of Cherbourg. And then she ended up marrying an American soldier and coming to live near me in East Tennessee. So I was interviewing her for the book. But when I talked about it a lot at different schools, and one kid raised their hand and said, would you have been brave enough to do what Suzanne did? And that actually works really well for the Night War too, because would I have been brave enough to do the things Miri did? And I was really brought up short by it. And I said, I don't know, but I hope so. And that's still the answer for Miri and what she does is I don't know if I would be that brave in that circumstance, but I like to think that I would be. I hope so.
Yeah, that's great. Andrea.
I haven't talked about Squee at a school visit because it's not out yet, but at a school a small private school that was founded by nuns, I was talking about the many meanings of Melan. And in that book, Melan moves to a small town in Ohio and is renamed Melanie by her new school principal because, it's a more Western acceptable name. And so I talk about the power of names during my presentation, and a sixth grader stood up and announced that they were non-binary and had recently come out to their friends and family, and then told everybody their new name in front of their peers. And I just found that to be an incredibly moving experience.
That is awesome. I love that. Veera, bring us home, please.
Well, going back to food, sometimes when I go to schools and I talk a lot about the food in both books, The Night Diary and A Meal in the After, sometimes schools with bigger South Asian populations, when I show a slide and has like all my favorite foods and all the kulfi and pakoras and chapatis and all these things that are in the book, they cheer. And I just like talking about kulfi like makes everybody cheer and clap, and it's really fun, and it makes everybody hungry. So
I'm so glad you said that. I spent way too much money on biryani while reading your book, so thank you for that. Folks, thank all four of you. I mean, this has been amazing. We could talk for hours, and there's so much to dig into. I hope everybody checks out your books. And thanks again. Yeah, this was fantastic.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
All right, and I will do some closing proceedings, and I will wave goodbye. You're welcome to turn off your cameras. So tomorrow, all attendees will receive an email containing links to today's slide presentation, title list, certificate of completion, and video recording. For more about Booklist webinars, be sure to visit booklistonline.com/webinars, where you can view archives of past webinars and register for upcoming ones like those you see here. Staff training, in-services, local conference, Booklist can help. You can now request free copies of Booklist and Booklist Reader for upcoming staff training programs, so you can help the next generation of library workers become readers advisory and collection development superstars. Scan the QR code on the screen, visit our website, or email info@booklistonline.com for more details. Mastering the art of reader's advisory involves ongoing study, both of major concepts that form the backbone of good RA practice and of the skills that make your RA practice effective in the day-to-day. Join Booklist on Thursday, March 14th for a free extended workshop designed to keep you up to speed on both the ideas and practice that will enhance your RA game. Register now to learn from experts in the field about how genres relate to each other, how to talk to patrons about their leisure reading, and how to write an effective book annotation. You can visit our website for details. Thank you again for joining us for today's webinar. One more huge thank you to all of our awesome panelists and to our sponsor, Penguin Young Readers. This concludes today's webinar. See you next time.